How do you find economic data? Well, there's a number of sources to help you find information about Canada, Alberta, the US, and even other countries. The best place to find economic data is from the source. So if you're looking for Canadian data, you want to get it from the Canadian government. If you are looking for US data, you want to go to the US government, and so on. So let's take a look at some of the websites where you can get information. So what we see here is the Statistics Canada website. And so if you go to statcan.gc.ca, on the front page you see a number of indicators. So we can see here the quarterly population estimate. So that number there tells you how many people are living in Canada right now. You also see the Consumer Price Index, and that Consumer Price Index tells you about inflation. So it's looking at how much prices have increased in the last 12 months. You also see an unemployment rate, and you can see real GDP using the expenditure approach. This semester we're going to talk about that expenditure approach, and we're going to talk about what it means for GDP to be real. Let's dig a little bit deeper here, and for example, if we click on the unemployment rate, we can then scroll down through a bunch of the text to the graphs that are at the bottom of the page. So for example, if you select Table 1, what you will see is you will see where it says population. That's the working age population. That's people who are over 15 who can work. The labor force, that's the number of people who either have a job or are looking for a job. And as you scroll down, you can see the number who are employed full-time and part-time. You can see the unemployment rate and the employment rate. Now this graph breaks it down by gender, men and women, as well as youth, so age 15 to 24. If we go back, Table 3, we click on that, what you'll see is that same information: working age population, labor force, a number of employed, part-time, full-time, and the unemployment rate. And you'll see that by province. So in fact, you can scroll down and you can find the unemployment rate for each province. So for example, we can see that Newfoundland and Labrador, in June of 2017, the unemployment rate was 14.9, and in July it was 15.7. All right, what else can we find on the StatsCan website? So we'll just go back to that main page. So unemployment, labor force, information about the labor in each province, that was all under the unemployment rate. To find out information about GDP, we can click here where it says real GDP by expenditure. And we see here how much growth we have had, as that's what you see on the top right. You can also see where the sources of growth are coming from. So we'll talk about the different parts of GDP, gross domestic product. We'll break it down and look at each of these categories, but you can see that a lot of that growth is coming from households. Households doing consumption spending, buying goods and services. Let's go back. These graphs here will show you gross domestic product over time. Again, at the very bottom, you can see tables just like we saw with unemployment, but this time they're based on GDP. So what we want is we want to know what the gross domestic product is, not the real GDP, that's where we take out inflation, but we want to know gross domestic product. So what is the total value of everything we make in Canada? And we can find that information here in Table 1. So notice at the bottom of Table 1 it says gross domestic product at market prices. And so you can see in the second quarter of 2017 that the total value of everything we made in Canada was worth about just over $2 trillion. Just go back here. So back here on the main page, again, we can get information about inflation, about the population, unemployment, and the size of the economy and whether or not it is growing. So real GDP by expenditures, you see that arrow going up, tells us we are currently getting economic growth. All right, so let's look at our next location of information, and that is, what if we want US data? So here we have the census in the US Census Bureau at census.gov, and you'll notice at the top of the page you can see the US population. So you see that comparing US and Canada, Canada has about 10% of the US population in comparison. We can go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Again, this will give us US data. And on the right here, you can see the unemployment rate for Canada. You can also see their consumer price index. So that percentage there will be your inflation, how much prices have increased. Other sources of US information, we can go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And if you're looking for information about the gross domestic product of the US, you would click here on GDP, and you'll notice that it says current dollar and real GDP in Excel. If you click on that, you will get the current GDP in both real terms and what we call nominal terms. So nominal is the total value in today's dollars. Real, we've adjusted for inflation, and we'll talk about how to adjust for inflation this semester. But if you click on that, you can get many years worth of gross domestic product for the US. All right, so we've talked about some key sources for Canada information, for US information. What about Alberta? Well, we can go to what is called the Economic Dashboard for Alberta, and here you can get some key insights into what's happening with the Alberta economy. If you scroll down, you can get the July unemployment rate. We see it there at 7.8%. That's the unemployment rate in Alberta. You can keep scrolling down, and you'll see a consumer price index of 137. We'll talk this semester about what that index is and what that number means. But for now, if you look at that little bottom left where it says 1%, that tells you how much inflation there's been in the last year. If you keep scrolling down more, you can see the total value of everything that's made in Alberta, and that would be that GDP that you see right there. You can also get population information about Alberta and specifics about certain industries, from housing to retail and so on. So it's a great place to check out information about Alberta. For Alberta's labor information, we can go to the monthly labor force statistics. And if you click on where it says Labor Force Statistics Public Package, then that will give you the labor data for Alberta. So we can figure out the size of the labor force, the number of people who are employed, and get the unemployment rate. As you scroll down, you can also see it by city. So we can see Red Deer and other cities within Alberta. You can also see a comparison by gender and age as well. Now, if you want information about exchange rates, you can go to the Bank of Canada website. And so here we see the US-Canada exchange rate. What you will also find here is interest rates. So in the survey that you did, you were looking at the bank rate, the overnight target rate, and the prime rate. So what's the difference between them? Well, we can see here on this website, it shows the overnight target rate at 0.75%. This is the rate at which, say, Royal Bank could borrow money from CIBC. So banks can borrow from each other if they're short on cash. The bank rate, that's the rate at which banks can borrow from the Bank of Canada, is always 0.25% above the overnight target rate. So the bank rate is 1% if the overnight target rate is 0.75%. And this This is to encourage banks like Royal Bank to borrow from another bank before it borrows from Canada, from the Bank of Canada. Now, when you borrow money, you pay plus or minus prime. And we can find the prime rate on this as well. So you see it says prime rate down at the bottom here, 2.95%. So if you are getting a car loan or a mortgage, then you may pay prime plus a half. Or depending on your credit worthiness, it'll be plus or minus prime. So you can get that prime rate here. If we want to compare countries, there are sources you can go to compare. So for example, a lot of the graphs that I use come from a website called Trading Economics. And what you see here is a lot of economic data across multiple countries. So if I click, for example, on the United States, you can see their growth rate and GDP, you can see the unemployment rate, the inflation rate. Okay. We can see their balance of trade, so we're talking about imports and exports, and we'll talk more about the balance of trade this semester. You can also see their debt, so this is government debt compared to their GDP. And so you can look at as you scroll through, there's lots of different data here, economic data. If you click on any one in particular, so for example, if we click on the inflation rate, we can look at what has been happening with their prices over time. Okay, so you can see, for example, in periods of recession, dips, and that would indicate the economy is contracting, and of course if people aren't spending, then prices start falling. So you can go through each country and you can look at information here. So we can look at growth, for example, and you can go maximum and you can see some instability in the market, years of growth and years of contraction. You can also get a lot of information from the World Factbook. So here what we're looking at, this is created by the Central Intelligence Agency in the US, the CIA, but they collect a lot of data about countries. And so, for example, on this web page, we can see the debt, that's all levels, so city or municipal, provincial or state, and federal, all combined. So what amount of debt do these countries have? And we can see Japan has more than 2 times the amount of debt compared to the value of what they make. We'll talk more about debt and the impact it has later this semester. As you look at debt, we could look, for example, at Canada's federal debt. So this website here shows you how much is owed just the federal debt and the portion of it if we were to divide it among the population. We can see similar types of information on the US. This is the US debt clock. And so you can see how much the US owes in terms of its debt as well as its spending. So there's a lot of great sources on economic data. Remember, the key is to go to the government's website if you can to get the information, because that will be the most up-to-date and the most accurate. If you tend to just Google for the economic data, the data you get might not be in Canadian dollars, it might be in US, or it might be a year or 2 old. So it's good to go to the source and use this information to figure out what's happening with the economy. This semester we're going to be comparing the US, Canadian, and looking at the Alberta economy to see how they're doing, and so we're going to talk more about each of these statistics, where they come from, how they're measured, and what they tell us.